Hey yo, salute to all my subscribers, and a special shout out to everybody else passing through. YouTube, what's good? Alright, so I've been looking to do this one for a while, just haven't gotten around to it until now. This is going to be another installment in the Address the Comments playlist on this platform where every now and then I come across a comment from one of either a subscriber or a viewer who just wants to chime in on, a video I did, a blog I did. And sometimes it's a back and forth, as in the case of this one that I'm going to get into. Now, I've been looking to address this. I believe he's subscribed. I'm not sure. Medical Sour. Typically, Medical Sour has some very colorful comments on a lot of the content that I post. And what I respect about Medical Sour is he has no issue with voicing exactly what his opinion is. And while some people may look at some of the comments that he makes as being inflammatory, being a little bit controversial, which I do agree they are that. But at the same time, this platform is here for people to speak their mind exactly how they feel, good, bad, or indifferent. And if nothing else, what I respect about Medical Sour is some of the comments that they make, and the reason why I always address them and why I always speak out on them on this platform, usually after going back and forth in the form of another video or blog, is because I feel like the comments that Medical Sour makes, they are the sentiments of a lot of people. Even if most of the people who feel that way and who comment similar comments, they typically are responsible for perpetuating a lot of the stuff that they comment against. But if it provokes conversation, if it instigates a discussion, then I think it's viable, and I think it should be addressed here on this platform and this channel. So, having said that, recently I did a video talking about racism, and Medical Sour commented and said that there was no such thing as racism. Now, initially, when I saw the comment, I was like, "Oh yeah, he's bugging. I can't even respond to this." And then I started thinking, and I was like, "Well, let me see where this goes." So then, Medical Sour went on to say that he says, quote, "I see you believe in a false narrative of racism." So I said, so you're really going to ignore the systemic racism in this country. So explain the plight of the people who were victims of it. And I'm talking even about the things that predate the crack cocaine epidemic. Because in a past back and forth that Medical Sour and I had, he made mention of how black people create a lot of their problems, which everybody can be somewhat responsible for some of the problems that they have. But a lot of the things I notice, not dealing with Medical Sour, but a lot of the things I notice when I talk to people who have issues with some of the complaints of black people, usually it has to do with a time period in this country where, crack cocaine was being flooded into our inner city streets, and these unreasonable laws against the possession and the distribution of drugs that bore these ridiculous 10, 20, 30-year life, up to life sentences. And a lot of these were nonviolent crimes. So I deliberately said predates that era, because how do you explain the civil rights movement and the many people who fought, bled, and died just trying to acquire some of the same rights that everyone else had? And so Medical Sour's response was that I have no proof of racism, that I listen to the liberal media, and that black people have a thing called learned helplessness. Now that's the comment right there that can be considered inflammatory on the surface. But here's the thing. If there's any truth to black people having learned helplessness, On a certain level, there may be some truth to it, but is that in support of my statement or in support of Medical Sour's statement that racism doesn't exist? Because when you take a people that have been enslaved and imprisoned during the time of slavery in this country, we're talking 400 plus years, and some even believe that it went on longer than that. How can there not be learned helplessness? On this platform, a lot I talk about behavior and how all behavior is learned. And helplessness it's a behavior. It falls into that category. When you have a people that have been so conditioned to not be allowed to be independent, to not be allowed to have rights, to not be allowed to be afforded some of the same civil liberties that whites and everyone else has had in this country, with the exception of Native Americans, since this country's inception, how can there not be some learned helplessness? Of course there would be. And then even when slavery ended, and we've talked about this on this platform as well, you have the introduction of all of these Jim Crow laws that then took the slaves who were liberated from being property to then the status quo being, well, but you're only 3/5 of a person, and we're not going to hire you. We're not going to let you vote. We're not going to let you do any of the things that whites can do in this country. And by the way, if you don't get a job, which we're not going to give you a job, but if you don't get one, we're gonna make that illegal. So now you're going to be able to be put into prison for not having a job. You're going to be able to be put into jail for not having a home. So they made being homeless illegal, and all these different things that then allowed slaves who were freed to then be put back in chains. And we all know, once you're convicted of a crime and put into jail, you can then at that point legally have your rights stripped away from you. So how can there not be a learned helplessness there? How can there not be? It's only been a little more than 50 years since the civil rights movement and the success that came out of all the people who marched and who picketed and who boycotted and who fought and who bled and who died to afford us the rights that so many of us take for granted. So we've been in captivity. We've been unequal for far longer in this country than we have been equal, than we have been looked at as truly being American citizens. And some people would argue, and there would be truth to it, that that fight is still long from being over, because now more than ever, you have the same people who refuse to lay that racism, that hatred down, basically killing us and getting away with it a lot more often than they're not. So that was a side note. Then I responded, well, I've experienced it myself. It's definitely real, referring to racism. And the last comment that Medical Sour responded with was that you may have experienced discrimination or even hate. I have as well, mostly from other blacks. But there's only good and evil, no racism. And that was the comment that I decided, okay, I need to address this. And I'm going to get into why. I agree. Ultimately, there's right and wrong, and there's good versus evil. You're 100% right. But in a world, and in a nation, and in a day and time when everything is categorized and compartmentalized, whether you look at that as being a good thing or a bad thing, it exists for a reason. You have to be able to identify what you're dealing with. You have to be able to put a name to something, right? Hate is the ultimate manifestation of anything negative, right? Discrimination, racism, sexism, ageism, whatever other isms you could think of. It all boils down to hate. But you have to give it a name. And you have to give it a name because those people who are real victims of those different isms, of those different things that persecute and hold down and are treated badly, you have to put a name to it because you have to identify the plight of those people. You have to. And so the same, hate is just hate in a general sense. But once you couple that hate with it only being perpetuated against a group of people based solely on a thing, that thing having no merit, just simply those people being who they are, that's when you categorize it into different things. So if you have hate, like Medical Sour says, it's only hate, it's only good versus evil. Okay. So if you look at it from that standpoint, when you have hate toward a group of people simply because they're elderly, right? And you don't want to give those people jobs, you don't want to treat those people equally as people who are not elderly, that's when it becomes ageism. When you hate a group simply because of them being a part of the female gender and you don't want to pay them equally for equal work, and for so long they weren't allowed to vote and they were treated even less than black people or equal to what black people were. There was a time in this country where women, white or black, couldn't even have a bank account in their name unless their husband or their father signed off on it. So when you look at hate in that context, it becomes sexism. When you look at hating a group of people simply because they're in a lower class, it becomes classism. Simply because they don't have the finances, or they're not able to afford certain things, right? They're categorized as being in a lower class. It's classism. And when you hate a group simply because of the color of their skin, simply because of what race they identify as, that's where racism comes into play. But what makes it systemic is that it's not, see, here's the mistake that Medical Sour is making. Discrimination, the reason why, see, racism is the definition. Discrimination it's a subset of racism, right? If you look at a sentence, a structure of a sentence, and you say, okay, there's an adjective and there's a verb in this sentence. If racism is the adjective, that's what's being explained as what is happening. Discrimination would be the verb. That's racism in practice. You're discriminating against someone strictly because of what race they identify as. That is racism. To say it's just discrimination, well, that's just what you're doing. But the classification of it is racism. The reason why it's systemic, and he made mention to, the discrimination that he dealt with was mostly from other blacks. And I've talked about this on this channel as well. And some people agree and some people don't. Black people can be prejudiced. Black people can in some cases discriminate. But when it comes to racism, black people as a group cannot perpetuate that. Because racism, what throws something over the threshold into being racism is the systemic properties there. We don't have, as a group, as a community, black people, we don't have the power to affect any other group's livelihood, any other group's freedoms and civil liberties. We don't have the power to affect those things negatively. That's what makes it racism. Without that property there, without that facet of it, then it's just prejudice. And yes, black people can be prejudiced against other black people, of course. But in order for something to be changed over into racism, you have to look at the history. It's systemic. We couldn't go to schools with white people. We couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white people. We couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white people. We couldn't vote. We couldn't have same types of jobs that white people were able to have because we couldn't get that education. The systemic limitations that were put in front of us that kept us, as Medical Sour put it, learning that helpless behavior for so long. You have to identify it. You can't say it just doesn't exist. You can't say it's propaganda perpetuated by the media and you're believing it or you're buying into it. You can't do that, because there was a time in this country that black people literally, this was literally in print and black and white, literally legislation written into law, that black people were only 3/5 of a human being. So we were treated as being slightly more human or slightly more important than an animal or a pet. You can't say that that didn't exist. You can't. Especially when there are people who are still walking around on the face of this earth who were alive during that time, because it was not that long ago. See, people will try and change the history.